This information may save your life. That was a lie. However, welcome to the Squadron vehicle tier list. The Firecrest is quite a strange aircraft equipped with two 50 caliber machine guns. Quite uniquely, these are actually the M3, much later variant of those guns. But despite the fact that these guns are actually quite modern compared to the aircraft you're flying alongside, the fact that you've only got two of them means the damage output of the aircraft is quite underwhelming. What really makes the aircraft interesting is the fact that you get access to a torpedo, which not many aircraft around this battle rating get access to, which gives some nice utility when it comes to naval battles. And for ground forces, you have access to bombs and RP-3s, which makes it a pretty formidable close air support vehicle, especially at a low battle rating of 2.3. Personally, I quite like the RP-3s, but there's nothing wrong with the bombs, and when you're at this lower battle rating in ground forces, the flight performance aspect of the aircraft is a lot less important, as you're generally fighting enemy aircraft that are much less geared towards close air support than the more dedicated fighters that you might find in aerialistic battles. As for ARB, this plane just isn't worth it. You do get the interceptor air spawn, which does give you at least something to work with, but you don't really have the climb rate to capitalise on that air spawn, especially as this is one of those sort of aircraft that you can't really push wet for too long, as just after 3 or 4 minutes you have some pretty significant overheating problems, and if you don't come off the throttle, your engine will go yellow and you'll eventually fall out the sky. It's not that important, but something I personally quite like is when the aircraft are able to dive at a significant speed. The Firecrest, you're able to go 5, 7, 800 kilometers an hour in a dive, absolutely no problem, and it even has access to air brakes, which are nice while landing, and it's particularly useful for torpedo runs, as you're only able to drop torpedoes at a maximum speed, so being able to lose speed very efficiently and on command is very helpful. Really, the main place where this aircraft shines is naval battles, because in ground forces, there's not really a reason to fly this over something like a Hurricane Mark IV. You could probably bump this plane up a tier or even 2 if you're particularly into low tier British naval forces, but since there's only about 6 people playing naval, and I'm not one of them, this plane is overshadowed, slow, and not particularly fun. F tier. The next vehicle is one of the most unique in the game, and it's certainly an interesting gameplay experience. The M1A1 is equipped with a dual ITO launcher, and if you haven't seen it before, you aren't going to forget this design in a hurry. The idea behind the vehicle is simple. There's no crew in the turret, so you can hide the M113 chassis behind any sort of cover and take out enemies with relative impunity. At the time of making this video, you don't seem to get ammo racked in the launch mechanism of the vehicle. The problem is a lack of versatility, and there's not that many locations and places where you can actually use this hiding behind cover tactic to its utmost effectiveness. The missile damage is very good, and you'll find that you generally one-shot vehicles, and having the advantage of no reload to fire a second shot can definitely come in handy. Annoyingly though, this, like many other ATGM launchers, can't fire on the move, and what makes that worse is the M901 has a mechanic where the turret will stow itself away, which means your time to fire is artificially extended, as you've got to not only wait for the vehicle to stop, you've got to wait for the launcher mechanism to deploy. You'll find that the launcher mechanism has a pretty good turret traverse speed, so that does help getting on target. Annoyingly, the total reserve ammunition that you're able to bring is quite limited, so if you do end up taking out quite a few enemies, you're going to have to find your way back to a capture zone to get more ammunition. The M901 does get access to thermals, and the magnification on the sniper scope is excellent. The vehicle is very niche, but it does have a few advantages going for it. It's annoying that it doesn't have access to scouting. Obviously the scouting mechanic is more for light tanks, but there are some examples of tank destroyers getting access to this feature, so it's something I'd definitely like to see in the future. Overall, the vehicle can be a lot of fun, and it has some unique advantages in specific situations, but it's a little bit too niche to be generally considered good. I would recommend considering the vehicle, especially if you've already got a strong 8.3 lineup and you can pick and choose when you want to spawn the vehicle, but as a vehicle you're looking to spawn every single match, this vehicle is not that. Overall, it is a very fun vehicle, but that doesn't make it good. E tier. If you're interested in playing around with some swing-wing variable geometry aircraft, the Su-22 might be a great option for you. It's got a few different options for air and ground, but it doesn't necessarily do any one particular thing very well. In aerialistic battles, you get a huge amount of bombs if you want to go bombing bases, and for enemy aircraft, you get access to 6 R60s. As you start to fight more and more planes with flares, the R60 starts to not do so well, but because you've got so many of them, you can just spam them off, and half the time the enemy player won't really be paying attention. When it comes to flares, you've only got 12 of them. They are the large countermeasures, so you only have to deploy 1 or 2 for an incoming missile, but if you get jumped by several enemy aircraft at once, it's just not enough. Annoyingly as well, you don't get access to semi-auto mode when it comes to the wing sweep. You're limited to between the fully auto and a fully manual, which is not a huge deal, but it's definitely annoying. For ground forces, you get some very interesting weapons, and they are very long range, and in theory this plane is an excellent close air support vehicle. The reality though is quite different to the on-paper statistics. The main missile that you're going to be wanting to use requires you to continuously fly in a straight line to have a laser pointer marked on the enemy target, and you don't have to be a genius to realise that flying in a straight line against extremely powerful enemy anti-aircraft is not a good idea. What makes this worse and honestly very frustrating is the fact that the zoom magnification on the targeting pod is very, very poor, so even spotting enemies in the first place is quite a challenge. If you're specifically interested in variable geometry aircraft, the Su-22 is a great option if you want to avoid grinding through a whole tech tree, but other than that, it's not particularly unique, interesting, or effective. E tier. The Me-262 is unique in the armament it gets access to, and specifically access to the Mk103 cannons. It's not new for an Me-262 to be equipped with 30mm cannons, but it is new for them to be equipped with specifically the Mk103 variant of those 30mm cannons. Usually you'll find they have the Mk108s, which are very effective at taking down aircraft, but aren't so good at taking down ground vehicles. However, the Mk103s come with HVAP and are excellent for close air support. Although, for this aircraft, beyond the guns, there's not much more going for it. The aircraft is much more suited for ground forces, but I will mention aerialistic briefly. This plane definitely suffers from a lot of the problems that are common to early jets, and although you do get an air spawn, it's not enough of an advantage to allow you to fly aggressively, and if you're not careful, that air spawn leaves you far away from friendly aircraft and an easy target if several enemy aircraft all decide to attack you specifically. But to be honest, you can avoid this by not being too aggressive and using your brain. The main takeaway of this is that the air performance of the aircraft is very, very difficult to deal with and takes a lot of patience, and it really isn't worth flying in an air-to-air role. So if you are planning to play this in aerialistic battles, you're much better off going for ground targets and whittling away at enemy tickets that way. Of course though, the place where close air support shines the most is ground forces, and the penetration that you'll find on the guns is excellent. And there's not really any sort of tank armor that can stop you from taking them out. Depending on the tech tree you've played the most, you might not have had a chance to play with gun-based close air support. And really the key difference here, compared to something with a bomb, is that the time to destroy a vehicle, particularly sort of medium and heavy tanks, is much extended compared to just dropping a bomb on the enemy roof. What I'd recommend is actually to not necessarily go for enemy targets being destroyed, but for actually taking out engines and tracks and barrels. If you're able to take out the enemy vehicle, that is obviously nice, but stopping the enemy and supporting your team and setting vehicles on fire is going to be a lot better use of your ammunition overall. You will find, of course, that your ammunition runs out slightly quicker than you would like, and the gun's accuracy isn't great, and that's particularly bad before you get the 30mm gun upgrade modification. If you're considering this as one of your first squadron vehicles, unless you've got a good ground forces lineup to play it with, I really wouldn't recommend it, even if it looks like an appealing, easy way to get access to jet aircraft. And keep in mind, if you're only occasionally spawning it into a ground forces match, it's not going to be that effective at researching the tech tree. And to be honest, if I wasn't making this video, I probably wouldn't even consider it myself, because you're just better off spawning something like a Dorado or maybe even a Do 335. There's definitely some utility to the aircraft in aerialistic battles for score-based events or just grinding Silver Lions by taking out aerialistic ground targets, but overall, aside from that, there's generally better options. D tier. The Magach 6B is an M60 style tank equipped with a pretty powerful APFS DS round, Like many of the other M60s in the game, it sits in a weird spot where it's this relatively unarmoured tank with average mobility, and yet it still performs pretty okay. The tank is covered in huge amounts of ERA, and it definitely helps against some kind of heat projectiles that you're going to be facing, but generally it's not that useful. You can deploy the smoke grenades a number of times, just like a bunch of the other Israeli tanks. And whenever I play an M60 or an M48, I'm always sort of expecting it to be a bit slower than it ends up actually being. So it definitely doesn't mean it's a fast tank, but it's not necessarily as bad as you might initially expect. Again, like many of the Israeli tanks, the vehicle is completely covered in machine guns, and it's really helpful for taking down helicopters or low-flying aircraft. There's a particularly nice, really well-made high-resolution camouflage that you can find on the Gaijin market. The tank fits right into a lineup alongside all the other Israeli tanks you've got access to, and uniquely, unlike a lot of the other Squadron vehicles we're going to talk about in this video, this one is actually pretty good at grinding, as all you have to do is get to rank 5, and this tank is effective at researching all the way up to rank 7, which makes up a majority of the tech tree. And seeing as the tech tree starts only at rank 4, it doesn't take much to be in a position where this can be used as a main grinding vehicle. The reload speed is nothing special, the mobility is okay, and the protection is pretty average. Despite that, this is probably a tank that most people haven't even considered playing, and it's a pretty fun one overall. If you never played an M60 before, this is a great way to get into them. C tier. If you're wanting to play more of the higher tier jets and get into air-to-air missile kind of gameplay, then the Sea Harrier might be for you. Unlike some of the other aircraft Squadron vehicles we've talked about, this one is definitely a lot more geared to air-to-air combat than the close air support role. You might even be surprised to find that the Harrier doesn't get access to any sort of bombs or guided Maverick missiles. Critically though, you do get access to 4 AIM-9L all-aspect air-to-air missiles, which are excellent at taking down enemy aircraft. That is, if you're able to launch them, and sometimes getting into range where you can actually fire is a little bit problematic because the aircraft is pretty slow compared to the other aircraft around the battle rating you're playing at. Air realistic battles has always been about your positioning, and it's super emphasized with this vehicle because there's pretty much nothing in the game that can't avoid you just by flying away. Defensively, you get access to 60 countermeasures, and thankfully you do get this when you're stock. It's not a bad amount of countermeasures, but it's nothing special either. It's worth noting that you can put out fires with the fire suppression system, but I never really found this to be too useful on any aircraft. If you do find yourself running out of flares, there is the option of using one of the dumbfire rocket pods as some makeshift flares, but I don't think it's a great idea for this aircraft in particular. Just like the other Harriers in the game, it accelerates very quickly, but keep in mind the engine will overheat if you keep it at maximum throttle, and it will eventually damage the engine. Generally, you're going to be wanting to fly around at 90 to 95% on the throttle, but in a huge dogfight, don't be completely afraid to use the throttle at its maximum, because it is a good few minutes until your engine does eventually take damage. So if you're in a situation where you're unlikely to survive anyway, you might as well use all the power you've got. Honestly, I'm not too sure who this aircraft is really for, because players who are very experienced in top tier jet air-to-air combat will already have access to similar Harriers in the tech tree, and I don't think this is a great option for players who are new to jets, because you're just going to get frustrated by the lack of speed. Annoyingly as well, you don't get access to any sort of radar missiles, which definitely lessens your ability to impact the early part of an ARB match. Something to keep in mind as well, if you do decide to play this plane in ground forces, don't forget, because the Harrier is a VTOL aircraft, it is allowed to rearm and repair on the helipad, which saves you a trip all the way back to the slightly further away airfield. Overall, it's a decent aircraft and fun to play, but I don't think there's any huge compelling reason to prioritise unlocking this over anything else. So if you're particularly interested in the Harrier, absolutely go for it. Otherwise, C tier. One of the big problems with Squadron vehicles is the lack of a lineup and options to respawn into after you've lost out on your primary vehicle. But the Apache pairs perfectly with a vehicle we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Now, I haven't played helicopters quite as much as the other vehicles in the game, but I did enjoy playing this one. You've got Hellfire missiles with 8 kilometers of range, and I wasn't really expecting much going into this vehicle, but I was pleasantly surprised. You'll find that the damage on the Hellfires is pretty good, and when the missile connects with an enemy vehicle, it generally one-shots it. You've got 8 kilometers of range on the missile, which is more than enough for taking out enemies from a decent distance away. It can be a little bit tricky to spot enemies, particularly when there's a lot of haze and buildings and terrain in the way, so having thermals is definitely a very nice addition. The 2 main options for guiding the missile is locking onto an enemy vehicle or guiding it manually with the mouse. It definitely does seem a lot easier to just put your mouse where you want the missile to go, because the lock is not very sticky and will love to lock onto anything but the thing you want to destroy. If you're new to playing helicopters, you might not realise, but in the user interface you can see that there's actually a countdown of how long until the missile is going to connect with the enemy. At the extreme range limits of your missile, it can take a decent amount of time for the missile to arrive, and that is a little bit frustrating, as they could easily go behind cover without even realising that they're being attacked, or one of your teammates could take them out. In terms of self-defense, when it comes to fighting enemy aircraft, there's not really many options here. You've got no air-to-air missiles to launch, and you're basically limited to the gun mounted to the helicopter. You can lock on and the game will auto-aim for you, but it's definitely not an ideal situation to be in. The AH-64 is definitely not the best helicopter at this battle rating, especially when you compare it to something like a KA-50, but if you're already playing a ground forces lineup this can slot into, and you've got crew slots going spare, it's a great way to get into helicopter gameplay without having to go through the huge grind that is helicopters. It has some room for improvement, but it's definitely not bad. I'm giving this one C tier. The Bhishma is one of the only vehicles in the game that represents India, and it's quite an interesting vehicle. This is a T-90 that you'll find in the British tech tree, and if it wasn't in this tech tree specifically, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. Because it's placed into a tree with vehicles that are so unlike it, it gives it some unique utility and is probably one of the funnest British tanks in the game. Interestingly, it has a HE fuse shell, but it's not so useful as you need to manually range the gun for it to work. You do have thermals, but this is only available in the sniper scope and the commander doesn't get access to them. Although, critically, the commander does have commander override, which is obviously a huge advantage. Something I don't think most people realise is that the Pradesh ground forces map is actually set in India, as you'll find a real life region of the world called Pradesh, and as according to the original dev blog it mentions that this map is set in the foothills of the Himalayas, it works out geographically. So if you're considering playing this tank, and I know a lot of people have this map banned, consider unbanning it so you can play your Indian tank on your Indian map. This tank has quite a unique front grille entrenching device, and I found that I was able to actually sort of spear enemy vehicles, lightly armoured ones, into it and stop them escaping. The T-90 of course has the advantage of being relatively small compared to other main battle tanks, which can come in handy when trying to physically hide the tank. Although the reload of the Bhishma is slower than some of its contemporaries, it complements the fast reload of the British Challenger tanks very well. You can kind of just pick and choose when you want to bring each tank depending on the map and the situation. You also have the standard Russian disadvantage of a lack of gun depression, but again, because the lineup is so strong, you can simply choose to spawn a different vehicle if the map is unfavourable to your situation. I did find the gun elevation speed of the tank to be a little bit slow, and that was a bit annoying, but it's not a huge deal. And unrelated to the actual gameplay of the vehicle, I think this is one of the best looking tanks in the game. It's a super high resolution model, and as I know you all enjoyed when I showed you the Melon mouse camouflage, prepare yourself for this is the Melon 90. Overall, it's a solid vehicle and it will slot right into any sort of lineup and it will help you grind. B tier. The Object 122 MTMC is a unique tank, and it does something I really wish a lot of other vehicles in the game would. Initially, you might look at this tank and think it's another boring medium tank that's firing an APFS-DS round, but in addition to its 120mm cannon, it gets access to 4 ATGMs. There aren't many vehicles in the game that have access to a secondary weapon that is just as capable as the primary, and it really complements the slow reload of the tank nicely. Critically though, the 4 ATGMs mounted to the outside of the tank don't count as ammo racks, so even if you're hitting them, it's not game over, and you're just unable to fire your ATGMs. Although, annoyingly, this is the kind of thing that Gaijin will just randomly change in a minor update, so if you're watching this in the far future, be aware that your tank might go kaboom. Having played so much of this game, I particularly enjoy any sort of vehicle with a unique mechanic, and being able to immediately follow up with an ATGM is incredibly useful. I found that the ATGM damage was more than enough to take out a vehicle all on its own. Annoyingly though, you aren't able to fire a second ATGM immediately after you fired the first one. In some ways, there's not much to say about the vehicle. It's a very standard sort of medium tank for the battle rating you're playing it at, and notably you've got a laser rangefinder and access to ESS, which is a little bit more useful, particularly in a down tier where enemies don't have access to thermals, and ESS is a lot more useful because, if you didn't know already, thermals completely negates the smoke of ESS smoke. I think this is one of those vehicles in the game that a few people will absolutely love and then most people think is very okay. It fits very nicely into the Chinese lineup that are available around this battle rating, and there's a huge amount of choice there. Something to keep in mind is unfortunately the ATGMs only have a 3km maximum range, so using them as an anti-helicopter weapon isn't really an option. The vehicle definitely doesn't have bad mobility, but compared to the extremely mobile vehicles that you start to see around this battle rating, you definitely start to feel a little sluggish. And this really isn't helped by the rather slow turret traverse speed and slow reload. Everything feels a little bit more slowed down and a little bit more intentional. The only thing that's stopping me from ranking this higher is really the slow to react fire control systems. If you do decide to unlock the vehicle, I don't think you're going to be too disappointed and you're going to have a great time. Overall, it's a fun tank with some unique mechanics. There's not a lot to complain about here. Another B tier tank. There's not many vehicles in the game that come from Australia, but the M1A1 AIM is one of them. This Abrams tank comes equipped with some excellent firepower and optics, and is pretty much everything you'd expect when it comes to an Abrams. You get access to the Keck W shell, which is an excellent piece of ordnance and able to penetrate pretty much everything you're going to be seeing at this battle rating, and the post-penetration damage for the APFSDS is pretty good. 1 to 2 well-placed shots will pretty much take out everything you're going to be facing. Just like many other Abrams and main battle tanks in general, this is equipped with blowout panels, so when your ammunition is hit, it doesn't necessarily mean you're instantly going to explode, but you are only left with one usable piece of ammunition loaded into the breech. The main advantages of this tank are the excellent optics and access to second generation thermals, which are much higher resolution than the first generation thermals you might have been more used to on similar Abrams tanks. The reload speed is really nice on this tank, and with an ace crew you get it down to 5 seconds, but notably, even without any sort of crew upgrades, the stock reload is at 6.5 seconds, which is still faster than a lot of the Russian autoloaders you'll be finding at this battle rating. Visually, I really like the design of the tank, and the camouflage that comes with it is really fun, with kangaroos and quite a unique camouflage pattern. The mobility of the vehicle is good, nothing crazy, but definitely enough to get you around the battlefield in a reasonable amount of time. It is a touch sluggish in close quarters areas where there's not too much room to manoeuvre, but that's more down to the fact that the tank is pretty big. And when it comes to the size of the vehicle, it is both an advantage and a disadvantage. On one hand, this helps your survivability as your crew are quite spaced out apart from each other, so any penetrating shot that enters the tank is unlikely to take out your entire crew. On the other hand, the largeness of the vehicle means you're a physically larger target to hit and easier to be hit, so just keep that in mind when you're cresting ridges and peeking around corners. Interestingly, this tank lacks a commander sight, but despite that, the commander is still fully capable of firing the main cannon when the gunner is taken out. I think this is one of the better options when it comes to squadron vehicles because it's the complete package of a vehicle. And when combined with the Apache that we spoke about before, you almost have a lineup. And there's been plenty of event vehicles and premiums around this battle rating, so there's plenty of options to fill out a lineup if you're completely new to top tier. Although if you're brand new to the game, it's not really recommended to jump into top tier battles. Overall, it's an absolutely solid vehicle in its own right with good firepower, optics and mobility, A tier. The next vehicle is a little bit confusing because when it comes to the Hunter, it's not really a vehicle that's well regarded by the general player base. You've got a couple of different variants of Hunter across the British tech tree, and if you play aerialistic battles, you don't really see these vehicles being played out much, which is usually a good indication that a vehicle isn't very good if people don't play it. But this hunter in the German tech tree is actually something quite special. It solves a lot of the problems the other hunters in the game have, and it's quite a lot of fun. Gets access to flares, AIM-9Js, an upgraded engine, and even access to Mavericks if you want to do some close air support. You might find that this aircraft is a little bit slow in an up tier, but one really nice thing about the Hunters is the energy retention, particularly in the horizontal, is excellent. And if you focus on keeping your speed up, it allows you to pounce on enemies who are either unaware or fighting your teammates or just lost a lot of energy for some other reason. And combine that with the flares, it actually gives you a decent amount of survivability and longevity in a drawn out dogfight. You've also got a radar warning receiver, which, although is nice, is not too useful as there isn't that many radar missiles at this battle rating, but it's definitely nice to have. Something I quite like about this plane is if you get a nighttime battle, the interior cockpit lighting is this cool blue colour. It definitely gives an interesting ambience when flying the aircraft. You're also equipped with the standard hunter gun loadout of 4 Aiden cannons, and although these sometimes suddenly start doing no damage in random minor updates, these weapons are generally very good and will shred anything it comes into contact with. The main reason though why I think this plane is a lot of fun is because the battle rating you're fighting at, you're going to be fighting a lot of A-10s and Su-25s, and I think that battle rating for a lot of people isn't really that much fun anymore, as these planes carry very powerful air-to-air missiles. So if you're playing anything that lacks flares or the ability to dodge those missiles, it can be very frustrating. But of course you've got flares on the Hunter, so you've got a lot more latitude to fly around with less care in the world for these weapons. If you find those planes specifically annoying, I'd highly recommend this plane, as everything about it pretty much hard counters those aircraft. And if you do happen to play the aircraft a lot, there's a pretty awesome camouflage you can unlock. It's fun, unique, and should probably go up in battle rating. A tier. The T-80 features as a squadron vehicle for 2 nations, Russia and Sweden. Broadly speaking, these vehicles are pretty similar and their gameplay and style are essentially the same, with some specific minor differences between the 2 variants. Notably, the T-80 UK has passive countermeasures which will interfere with the guidance systems on some of the ATGMs. The T-80 UK also has a slightly better shell, and because of that, the T-80 UK goes up in battle rating compared to the Swedish version. The 2 tanks play very similarly to each other, and Russian main battle tanks in general that you might have already been playing. Notably, these tanks get the 6.5 second autoloader instead of the slower 7.1 second system that you find on a majority of Russian main battle tanks, and it ends up making quite the difference, especially in close quarters and situations where there's a lot of enemy vehicles coming at you all at once. On the stat card of the Swedish version, there's a weird space between the 80 and the U, which doesn't match the Russian tech tree version of the T-80U. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be like that, but once you've noticed, you never unsee it. These tanks work very well on their own and also in a lineup. Like other Russian vehicles, things can get a bit tricky, particularly in hilly terrain due to a lack of gun depression. I wouldn't unlock these tanks just for the sake of playing them, as there's plenty of opportunity to play T-80 style tanks across the tech trees, but if you need something to fill out a lineup and give you more options when respawning, you can't really go wrong with these solid vehicles. A tier. The Leopard 2PL is a Polish modification of the Leopard 2A4, but despite being based on the Leopard 2A4, the turret modifications it received give you an excellent amount of protection, and you might actually be surprised at the kind of things that you can survive. For a vehicle of its battle rating, and a NATO tank in particular, the reload is pretty average, the thermals are of high resolution, so spotting enemies is nice and easy, and you get a fantastic APFSDS round that will easily help you take out any sort of enemies that you're going to come into contact with. The Leopard slots directly into your Germany top tier lineup, and you're going to have no problems respawning from a 2A6, a 2A5 directly into this tank. When I'm playing this tank, I'm generally spawning it towards the later part of a match after I've spawned several other vehicles. Unusually, unlike some of the other high rank vehicles we mentioned in this video, this one is rank 8, which is kind of a problem if you're looking to use this vehicle as a grinder, as it's only effective at grinding rank 7 and 8. Of course, if we ever see rank 9, that's actually going to become an advantage, but until then, it's something to keep in mind, as it definitely hurts the usability and viability of how far you can progress in the tech tree. As a vehicle itself, there's not really much wrong with it, and overall it's a great addition to the game and something really nice for players who are looking to get into top tier without having to grind every single vehicle. It's a main battle tank of all time. A tier. Sometimes vehicles are defined by the weapons they get, and for the TIE fighter, the F5 from Thailand, this is no understatement. The Python 3 missile completely changes how this plane flies. This particular F5 comes through the Japanese air tech tree, and the camouflage it gets is something I really like. If you've played other F5s in the game, this one flies very similarly, and you'll understand that the standout feature of this aircraft is that you can really throw it around. You might find that your top speed is a little lacking compared to some of the planes you're flying alongside, but it doesn't really matter because you're able to come into the dogfight and use your excellent energy retention to react to the ongoing battle, and allows you to really pick and choose which target you want to go for in particular. You get access to 2 AIM-9s as well as the Python 3 missiles, and in particular the Python 3 is very good, and you'll notice that it's easily able to cut right through enemy flares and still annihilate the enemy aircraft. Just like the other F5s in the game, you'll find that this aircraft has a stupid amount of survivability, and you're able to take a huge amount of damage, and while your plane will be crippled, it will still be flying. In ground forces, you've got 4 Maverick missiles, and these are excellent long-range self-guiding weapons that allow you to fly away from the battle as they guide themselves in. Massively frustratingly, the damage of the Mavericks is very inconsistent, and sometimes you'll take out their tank in one hit, and other times you'll be lucky if you take out their optics. I think this is partly down to the nature of Mavericks and how they sit in the current balance of the game, so if you're watching this far into the future, you might actually have a much better time using these weapons, or the plane might have even been given an upgraded variant of the Maverick. I'm not too sure what this plane is historically capable of carrying, but it's certainly something to keep an eye out for. When you're playing aerialistic battles, it's definitely a plane where you have to be careful with your flare usage, but it's not a plane where you need to be particularly worrisome about the amount of flares you're firing. Like other F5s, you get a lead indicator, but it's not so useful. If you are using the 20mm cannons on the plane, they are excellent and take down enemy aircraft very quickly. They've got good muzzle velocity, and combined with how the plane generally flies, they're relatively easy to aim. If you haven't played an F5 before, these are some of the most fun planes in the game to play, and this is another excellent example of them. And if you're playing Japan top tier ground forces, this is a vehicle you've got to include in your lineup. S tier. The Skyhawks are one of those vehicles where there's a huge variety of variants across the tech trees, and the one you get access to as a squadron vehicle is the A4E Early. I don't think it's going to take you long to realise that this is an aircraft clearly designed for close air support. It can of course be used in aerialistic, but there are definitely better options for that. Very quickly though, you do get access to 2 AIM-9Bs and a decent amount of bombs if you want to go bombing bases to unlock modifications. You get access to flares, which is quite unusual on an aircraft of this battle rating, and it's very nice to see, particularly in a full up tier when you start encountering very powerful air-to-air missiles. When you bring this plane to ground forces, you've got a huge amount of versatility of different ways to take out enemy ground units. Personally, I like to bring 2 walleye guided bombs and 3 bullpup missiles. The thing to keep in mind is that the most dangerous spar that you're going to be fighting at this battle rating are only the earliest variants of missile spar and mostly gun spar, and critically, you never have to face a Strela. The walleye guided bomb is more than capable of locking on and being dropped from well outside the effective range of these anti-aircraft. You can then follow up on enemy tanks or additional anti-aircraft with your bullpup missiles. These bullpup missiles can also be guided, but keep in mind these are manually guided by the player and aren't fully automatic like the walleye guided bombs. But similar to the bomb, they can be launched from a huge distance away, which means you've got 5 separate opportunities to take out enemy anti-aircraft. And realistically, the enemy team aren't going to have more than 1, 2, maybe even 3 anti-aircraft up at one time, and once you've taken those out, you're completely free to take out the enemy tanks. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to get a lock with the guided bomb, and obviously terrain and buildings and smoke will cause problems with your lock, but that's why it's so nice to have the option of firing bullpups as well, because if the enemy somehow know you're coming and deploy smoke, you can just launch a bullpup into their smoke cloud and completely annihilate them anyway. Interestingly as well, this is one of the few aircraft that gets access to takeoff boosters, which really helps with getting back into the fights nice and quickly. Although, once you run out of bombs and rockets, you don't necessarily have to immediately return to base, because you do have the option of using the 20mm to set things on fire and strafe things out. And on top of all of that, you've got access to a radar warning receiver, which will help you pinpoint the exact location of enemy anti-aircraft. Really, the only negative to this aircraft is the fact that the airframe is a little bit fragile and can easily wing rip at high G-forces, but this is mostly negated by uninstalling the new booster's modification. Before spawning this plane, you're going to want to look up and check out the cloud cover, because thick cloud cover will stop you from being able to drop your walleye guided bombs effectively, but a lot of the time there is a break in the clouds for you to sneak on through. And you've always got the option of just bringing 5 bullpups and taking out tanks with those dumbfire at close range. Overall, between the flares, the radar warning receiver, and the versatility of ordnance, this plane doesn't really do anything wrong in its intended role. S tier. The BMP-2M is a jack-of-all-trades, master of everything. You'll find this armoured fighting vehicle has no issue dispatching enemies, and where most vehicles of this type are equipped with APDS, this vehicle gets fully fledged APFSDS. You get more than enough ammunition to take out and fully disable enemy vehicles very quickly, because you're able to suddenly pounce on them with overwhelming amounts of firepower. And like other IFVs, you even have the option to pre-fire, like you're playing Counter-Strike or something. Interestingly, while most ATGM vehicles in the game require you stopping completely to fire, like the M1A1 we spoke about before, the BMP is able to fire fully on the move. And not only that, it has one of the best ATGMs in the game. The damage on the ATGMs is excellent, and you get thermals on the sniper scope. As it's a light tank, the BMP also gets access to scouting and a flyable scout drone. Because it's rank 7, your scout drone even gets thermals, something I don't think most people are actually aware of as being a feature. And by the way, this applies to any rank 7 scout drone. This tank gets access to a grenade launcher, and it doesn't really do any damage to enemy vehicles. You could use it to blind the enemy, but honestly, I kind of forgot it was even there most of the time. This is just one of those useless features that Gaijin add to vehicles just for the sake of it. This tank is all about versatility, and it's an excellent addition to any lineup, and if you weren't already versatile enough, the tank is fully capable of sailing in deep water, which in very rare circumstances can be useful, but is generally just a little bit of fun. I'm sure everyone's experienced this when shooting at the BMP chassis. Some very strange things happen when the ammunition is hit, and the armour you'll find is randomly able to survive the weirdest of hits that you really have no right of surviving. The most surprising thing about this tank is the battle rating, and the fact that it's extremely low for the options of performance you get access to. When I was making this video, I was playing the T80 UK in the same lineup as the BMP, and even though that means the BMP was in more than a full up tier, I didn't really notice any big differences in the performance of what I was capable of in the vehicle. Overall, this is not really fair or balanced. I highly recommend giving it a go. S tier. One of the brilliant things about War Thunder is the fact that the game is always changing, and that's great for the players, but it's not so good for me trying to make a video about a specific set of vehicles. So if you were expecting to hear about something that I haven't mentioned, it's probably because the vehicle wasn't released when I made this video. So if you're watching this video in the far future, you're going to want to click on this playlist right here to check out the new Squadron vehicles that didn't exist when I was saying these words. Or if you want to check out another tier list, click here to find out all about the Sherman tank tier list. I'm not one to upload very often, but if you got this far in the video, you clearly want to see more, so you're going to want to press that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.